The expedition vessel Kestrel hung suspended in the absolute blackness of the void, a needle of polished silver and reinforced ceramic that seemed entirely too small for the task at hold. It was a craft built for endurance rather than speed, its hull layered with sensory arrays and deep space scanning equipment that hummed with a constant, low-frequency vibration that the crew felt in their very marrow. Commander Aris Thorne stood at the primary viewing port of the bridge, staring out at the anomaly that had drawn them across 3 sectors of uncharted space. It was not a planet, nor was it a star, but a shimmering distortion in the fabric of the local continuum that looked like a great, translucent veil stretched thin across the stars. The light from the distant galactic core hit the edge of the phenomenon and shattered into a billion prismatic shards, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that defied standard optical classification. There was no heat signature, no gravitational pull, and no radio emissions emanating from the veil, yet it existed as a physical barrier that their long-range probes had failed to penetrate. Aris adjusted the collar of his flight suit, feeling the sweat slick against his skin as the ship drifted closer to the shimmering boundary. He was a man defined by his patience and his ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos, a trait that had made him the premier choice for this particular scouting mission. Beside him, the primary navigation console flickered with a steady stream of telemetry data that seemed to fluctuate in direct response to their proximity to the anomaly. The bridge was a cramped space, filled with the smell of recycled oxygen and the sharp tang of ozone from the overworked processors. There were no chairs for the bridge crew, only padded leaning posts that allowed for greater mobility during high maneuverability sequences. Specialist Vane was currently occupied with the fine-tuning of the forward shielding, his fingers dancing across the haptic interface with a fluidity that suggested years of mechanical intimacy with the ship's systems. He did not look up when the hull groaned under the first touch of the anomaly's influence. The Kestrel was beginning to vibrate, not with the mechanical shudder of a failing engine, but with a rhythmic pulsing that felt like the beating of a massive, unseen heart. Aris watched the external cameras as the first tendrils of the shimmering veil reached out to stroke the hull. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a liquid light that flowed over the silver plates of the Kestrel like mercury. The sensors began to scream, a high-pitched electronic wail that Vane quickly muted with a sharp command. They were crossing the threshold now, moving from the known universe into a pocket of space that had remained hidden since the dawn of time. The transition was not violent, but it was disorienting, a sensation of being stretched and compressed simultaneously as the physical laws they understood began to warp and bend under the pressure of the unknown. As the Kestrel punched through the final layer of the veil, the view outside the viewing port changed instantly. The blackness of the void was gone, replaced by a sky of deep, vibrant violet that was filled with drifting clouds of luminescent gas. There were no stars here, at least none that were visible to the naked eye, but the entire expanse was illuminated by a soft, ambient glow that seemed to come from every direction at once. Floating in the center of this strange new world was a massive structure, a series of interconnected rings and spires that looked like they had been grown rather than built. It was made of a material that resembled smoked glass, translucent and shifting with internal currents of light. The scale of the station was staggering, easily the size of a small moon, and it sat motionless in the violet sky like a sleeping god. Aris felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the structure was not abandoned. Tiny flickers of light were moving along its surface, and the sensors were finally picking up signs of life, not biological life as they knew it, but complex patterns of energy that mimicked the neural firing of a sentient brain. This was the target, the legendary repository of the precursors that had been the subject of myth and speculation for centuries. They had found it, and now they had to find a way to enter without triggering whatever defenses might still be active. Vane brought the Kestrel into a stable orbit around the station, his expression one of pure concentration as he navigated the complex gravitational eddies that swirled around the glass rings. The ship was performing admirably, its systems adapting to the strange physics of the pocket dimension with surprising ease. Aris moved to the communications station, attempting to broadcast a standard greeting on all known frequencies, but the only response was a low-pitched hum that seemed to resonate with the ship's own hull. It was not a rejection, but more of a recognition, as if the station were acknowledging their presence but waiting for them to prove their worth. The mission profile was clear. They were to establish contact, document the structure, and if possible, retrieve any data cores that could be safely extracted. There was no room for error and no backup if things went wrong. They were alone in a place that existed outside the maps of the known galaxy, and the weight of that isolation began to settle on the crew like a physical burden. Aris looked at the glass spires and wondered what kind of beings could have created such a masterpiece, and what had become of them in the eons since its construction. The decision was made to deploy a manned landing party to the surface of the outermost ring. Aris would lead the team himself, accompanied by Vane and the ship's primary biologist, Mara. They prepared their EVA suits with meticulous care, checking oxygen seals and power cells 3 times before stepping into the airlock. The suits were bulky and cumbersome, but they were the only things protecting them from the unknown environment of the station. As the airlock cycled and the outer door slid open, Aris stepped out onto the glass surface of the ring. It was not slippery as he had expected, but had a slight texture to it, like fine-grained sand trapped beneath a smooth veneer. Gravity was light, perhaps 1/3 of standard Earth norm, allowing them to move with long, gliding strides. The violet sky arched overhead, and the hum of the station was much louder here, a constant thrumming that they felt through the soles of their boots. Mara was already busy with her portable scanner, her eyes wide with wonder as the readings began to scroll across her visor's internal display. The material of the ring was not glass at all, but a sophisticated bio-polymer that was capable of self-repair and energy absorption. It was alive, in a sense, a massive organism that served as the foundation for the station's higher functions. They began to walk toward the nearest spire, a towering needle of dark obsidian that rose miles into the violet sky. The path was marked by glowing symbols that pulsed with a soft green light, guiding them toward a massive opening at the base of the spire. As they approached, the opening dilated like a giant iris, revealing a long corridor that stretched deep into the heart of the structure. There was no air in the corridor, but the walls were lined with crystalline displays that flickered to life as they entered. Images began to appear, maps of star systems they didn't recognize, blueprints for machines that defied the laws of thermodynamics, and glimpses of the beings who had once walked these halls. They were tall, slender creatures with multiple limbs and eyes that held the depth of ancient nebulae. They looked peaceful, their society built on a foundation of exploration and the pursuit of knowledge rather than conquest or war. Aris felt a profound sense of loss as he realized that these beings were likely gone, their legacy preserved only in this glass tomb. The corridor led them to a central chamber that was filled with a swirling mist of golden particles. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal holding a single, glowing sphere of pure white light. It was the heart of the station, the central processing unit that controlled every aspect of the precursor technology. As Aris reached out toward the sphere, the golden mist began to coalesce into a humanoid shape. It was not a physical being, but a holographic projection that looked startlingly real. The figure looked at Aris with eyes that seemed to see through his very soul, and for a moment, the silence in the chamber was absolute. Then a voice began to speak, not in words that Aris could hear, but in thoughts that formed directly in his mind. It spoke of the history of the station, of the great calamity that had forced the precursors to flee their home dimension, and of the hope they had that one day someone would find this place and carry on their work. The sphere was not just a data core, it was an invitation. It contained the sum total of their scientific achievements, a gift to the future from a race that refused to be forgotten. Aris felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. They had come seeking resources and tactical advantages, but what they had found was something far more precious. They had found the key to a future where humanity could finally move beyond the petty squabbles of their own history and take their place among the stars as true explorers. The holographic figure faded back into the golden mist, and the sphere began to glow with an even brighter light. Aris took a deep breath and reached out, his gloved fingers brushing the surface of the orb. A surge of energy flowed through him, a data transfer of such immense proportions that his mind felt like it was being rebuilt from the ground up. He saw the birth of stars, the formation of galaxies, and the intricate dance of matter and energy that sustained the universe. He understood the secrets of the veil, the mechanics of the pocket dimension, and the true purpose of the glass station. It was a bridge, a way to travel between worlds without the need for warp drives or wormholes. It was the ultimate achievement of a civilization that had mastered the very fabric of reality. When the transfer was complete, Aris collapsed to the floor of the chamber, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Vane and Mara rushed to his side, their voices sounding distant and muffled through his helmet's speakers. He looked up at them and smiled, a look of pure clarity in his eyes. They had what they came for, and so much more. The Kestrel would return to the known galaxy not as a scout ship, but as the herald of a new era. As they made their way back to the airlock, the station began to hum with a new energy. The glass rings started to rotate, and the violet sky deepened into a rich, dark indigo. The way home was open, but the universe would never be the same. Aris looked back one last time at the towering obsidian spire, a silent monument to a race that had seen the end of the world, and decided to leave a light on for whoever came next. The expedition was a success, but the real adventure was only just beginning. They had crossed the threshold of the unseen, and there was no going back. The stars were waiting, and for the first time in human history, they finally had the map to find their way. The interior of the primary spire was not a hollow shell, but a dense network of crystalline filaments that pulsed with a rhythmic, bioluminescent glow, mimicking the vascular system of a planetary-scale organism. As Aris, Vane, and Mara ventured deeper into the heart of the structure, the ambient temperature within their pressurized suits began to climb, forced upward by the sheer kinetic energy radiating from the walls. The airless corridors were wide enough to accommodate massive machinery, yet they possessed an aesthetic grace that suggested the architects valued form as much as function. Every surface was etched with microscopic fractals that seemed to shift and reform when viewed from the periphery of the eye, creating a sense of constant motion in a place that had been technically stagnant for millennia. Vane trailed behind the group, his specialized multi-tool extended to capture the unique electromagnetic signatures bleeding from the glass-like bulkheads. He noted that the frequency was shifting from a low thrum to a melodic resonance that vibrated through the composite plates of their boots, a physical language that felt increasingly urgent. Mara stopped frequently to sample the dust motes suspended in the static fields near the ventilation grills, finding that the particles were not debris but microscopic repair drones, currently dormant but structurally intact. The realization that they were walking inside a machine that could potentially wake up at any moment added a layer of tension to their steady march toward the central processing hub. They reached a vertical transit shaft that bypassed the need for traditional stairs or ladders, utilizing a series of localized gravity wells to ferry occupants between the different strata of the spire. Aris stepped into the shimmering blue field first, feeling a momentary surge of nausea as his internal equilibrium adjusted to the sudden shift in orientation. He floated upward with a gentle acceleration, followed closely by his teammates, their lights cutting through the hazy atmosphere of the shaft to reveal secondary chambers filled with dormant technology. Some rooms appeared to be laboratories, housing transparent cylinders that once contained biological specimens from 100 different worlds, while others were clearly dedicated to the maintenance of the station's environmental seals. The sheer volume of data being processed by their suit recorders was staggering, threatening to overwhelm the Kestrel's remote buffers. Aris signaled for a brief pause in a transitional foyer, allowing their systems to synchronize and purge the cache. The silence in the foyer was heavy, broken only by the mechanical wheeze of their own life support systems and the distant, metallic groan of the station adjusting to the gravitational pull of the surrounding pocket dimension. Mara adjusted her visor, pointing toward a massive doorway at the end of the hall that was inscribed with the image of a collapsing star, a universal symbol for high-energy containment. Beyond the doorway lay the resonant core, a chamber so vast that the far walls were lost in a thick, golden nebula of ionized gas. At the center of this expanse stood the primary reactor, a series of floating obsidian rings that rotated around a core of pure, trapped plasma. The heat here was intense, pushing their suit cooling systems to their absolute limits, but the sight was hypnotic. The plasma was not a chaotic storm, but a controlled, swirling lattice of white-hot energy that seemed to be weaving itself into complex geometric patterns. This was the power source that maintained the veil and kept the station hidden from the prying eyes of the greater galaxy. Vane moved toward a control plinth that rose from the floor like a jagged tooth, its surface covered in a liquid interface that responded to the heat of his gloved hand. As he touched the surface, the liquid rippled and formed a series of three-dimensional icons that represented the station's power distribution grid. He worked quickly, his mind racing to translate the alien logic of the system, realizing that the reactor was currently operating at less than 1% of its total capacity. Even at this idle state, it generated more power than a dozen human colonies combined, a testament to the terrifyingly advanced engineering of the creators. The holographic figure they had encountered previously manifested once more, though this time its form was more stable, shimmering with a silver light that reflected off the obsidian rings of the reactor. It did not speak through telepathy this time, but through a direct audio override of their suit comms, its voice a melodic blend of multiple tones that felt both ancient and melodic. It identified itself not as an individual, but as a mnemonic echo, a sophisticated artificial intelligence designed to guide those who possessed the genetic or intellectual markers of true explorers. The echo explained that the station was currently in a state of terminal decay, its structural integrity failing as the pocket dimension began to contract. The veil that protected them was also their prison. Unless the reactor was brought back to full power, The collapse would eventually crush the station and everything within it into a singularity. Aris listened with a grim intensity, his hand resting on the haptic interface of his own command console. The mission had shifted from a simple scouting operation to a desperate salvage and repair job. They needed to find the secondary ignition keys, located in the lower reaches of the station's industrial sector, and bring them here to stabilize the core before the countdown to collapse reached zero. The trek to the industrial sector took them through the underside of the station, a region where the polished glass gave way to raw, unshielded alloys and massive conduits that hummed with lethal amounts of electricity. Here, the grace of the upper levels was replaced by a brutalist efficiency, with giant pistons the size of skyscrapers moving in slow, rhythmic cycles to pump coolant through the station's veins. The floor was a mesh of reinforced steel, offering glimpses into the dark abyss below where the station's waste heat was vented into the void. Mara flagged a warning as her sensors picked up a series of mobile defense units, spidery, multi-legged automatons that patrolled the catwalks with silent precision. They were not actively hostile, their sensors glowing with a neutral amber light, but their presence was a reminder that this was still a high-security environment. The team moved with exaggerated caution, timing their movements to avoid the sweeping arcs of the sentries' scanners. They were intruders in a temple of industry, and the slightest misstep could trigger a security response that their light EVA suits were never designed to withstand. Aris led them across a narrow bridge that spanned a chasm filled with glowing blue fluid, his focus entirely on the navigation markers glowing on his HUD. In the heart of the industrial sector, they found the ignition keys, 3 massive cylinders of high-density exotic matter, suspended in a magnetic stasis field. The cylinders were nearly 6 feet tall and glowed with a faint violet light that matched the sky outside the station. Retrieving them would require a coordinated effort, as the magnetic fields had to be powered down in a specific sequence to prevent a catastrophic discharge. Vane took the lead on the technical override, while Aris and Mara prepared the heavy lift tethers to secure the cylinders for transport. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of hot metal and ionizing radiation, making every breath feel heavy and metallic. As Vane cut the first power coupling, the room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the strobing red lights of the emergency backup systems. The sentry drones in the hallway outside suddenly shifted from amber to a bright, aggressive crimson, their movement patterns becoming erratic and fast. They had triggered a localized lockdown, and the only way out was to fight through the automated defenses while hauling 3 tons of exotic matter back to the transit shafts. The return journey was a blur of high-stakes maneuvering and desperate suppression fire. Aris used his suit's integrated pulse welder to weld doors shut behind them, buying precious seconds as the spider drones tore through the metal with plasma cutters. Vane and Mara worked in tandem to guide the hovering ignition keys through the narrow corridors, the massive cylinders acting as improvised shields against the occasional stray bolt of energy. They reached the transit shaft just as the primary gravity wells began to flicker, the station's power failing in chunks as the reactor struggled to maintain its equilibrium. The ascent was violent, the gravity fields bucking and surging like a wild animal, but they managed to reach the resonant core just as the obsidian rings began to grind to a halt. The silver holographic echo was waiting for them, its form flickering as the ambient light in the chamber dimmed. With no time for delicate procedures, Vane slammed the ignition keys into their respective receptacles, the impact sending a shockwave through the floor that nearly knocked them off their feet. For a heartbeat, the chamber was silent, the plasma core shrinking to a tiny pinpoint of light that threatened to vanish entirely. Then, with a roar that was more felt than heard, the reactor ignited. A pillar of brilliant white light shot upward through the center of the obsidian rings, causing them to spin with a velocity that turned them into a blur of black glass. The golden nebula in the chamber began to glow with renewed intensity, and the temperature stabilized as the cooling systems roared back to life. On the bridge of the Kestrel, the crew watched as the station's internal lights flickered from a dying orange to a vibrant, healthy green. The collapse of the pocket dimension was halted, the fabric of spacetime around the station smoothing out as the veil was reinforced by the sudden influx of power. Aris slumped against the control plinth, his suit's power reserves nearly depleted, watching as the Silver Echo bowed in a gesture of profound gratitude. They had saved the repository, and in doing so, they had secured the future of the mission. But as the station began to broadcast a new, much stronger signal into the void, Aris realized that they might have also alerted something else to their presence, something that had been waiting in the dark for the lights to come back on. With the resonant core stabilized, the structural groaning that had plagued the station subsided into a harmonious, rhythmic pulse. The Kestrel remained docked at the outer ring, its hull now bathed in the steady, vibrant emerald light of the station's revitalized power grid. Aris, Vane, and Mara did not return to the ship immediately. The holographic echo had beckoned them toward the upper spires, a region previously inaccessible due to the power rationing of the decaying structure. This sector was the Archive of Echoes, the intellectual summit of the station where the creators had stored the sum of their cultural and historical identity. The transit to the upper levels was smooth, the gravity wells now operating with a liquid efficiency that made the ascent feel like floating through a dream. As they emerged into the archive, they were greeted not by the industrial grit of the lower levels or the clinical cold of the laboratories, but by an environment that mimicked a natural landscape. The walls were made of a living, translucent material that projected a panoramic view of a distant, long-dead world, a planet of golden oceans and floating mountains that must have been the precursor's original home. The archive was organized as a series of vast, open-air plazas, though the air was a synthetic cocktail of gases designed to preserve the delicate data crystals housed within thousands of obsidian pedestals. Each pedestal contained a fragment of a civilization, poetry written in the vibrations of light, mathematical proofs that treated time as a physical dimension, and detailed records of 1,000-year peace. Mara moved through the aisles with a reverence that bordered on the religious, her scanner recording the data at a rate that would take the ship's computers months to decode. She stopped before a central monument, a towering pillar of white stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. Unlike the other displays, this one was not a record of the past, but a real-time map of the station's current surroundings. To their horror, the map showed more than just the Kestrel and the shimmering veil. Dozens of small, needle-like shadows were clinging to the exterior of the pocket dimension, like parasites waiting for a breach in a host's skin. These were not precursor craft, nor were they human. Their silhouettes were jagged and asymmetrical, designed for a singular, aggressive purpose. The holographic echo appeared beside the monument, its silver form now tinged with a warning shade of amber. It explained that the reactivation of the resonant core had acted as a beacon, piercing the veil and drawing the attention of the scavengers, a nomadic, predatory species that had been hunting the remnants of precursor technology for eons. The scavengers did not seek knowledge or legacy. They sought the exotic matter within the reactor to fuel their dying fleet. They were currently testing the strength of the veil, looking for the harmonic frequency that would allow them to phase through the barrier without destroying themselves. Aris felt a cold weight settle in his chest as he realized that their success in saving the station had inadvertently doomed it to a siege. They were 3 explorers in an ancient tomb, and the wolves were at the door. Vane immediately began working with the archive's interface, searching for any mention of the station's external defense systems. He found that while the station was equipped with formidable weaponry, the targeting subroutines had been corrupted during the long centuries of dormancy. The team split up to address the looming threat. Vane stayed in the archive, attempting to bypass the corrupted software by manually slaving the station's weapon arrays to the Kestrel's more primitive but functional tactical computers. Mara continued her work at the central monument, trying to find a way to reinforce the Veil's frequency before the scavengers could find a breach. Aris, meanwhile, took a gravskiff from the archive's transport bay and headed toward the observation deck at the very top of the spire. He needed to see the enemy with his own eyes. From the high vantage point of the observation deck, the violet sky of the pocket dimension looked bruised and battered. Where the scavenger ships touched the Veil, the prismatic light shattered into dull, grey sparks. There were hundreds of them, ranging from small boarding craft to massive, slab-sided cruisers that loomed like tombstones against the indigo sky. They were patient, methodical, and utterly silent. Aris watched as a group of the smaller ships synchronized their engines, creating a localized vibration that caused the glass-like surface of the Veil to ripple and thin. Inside the archive, Vane was struggling with the alien logic of the defense grid. The precursors did not use traditional ballistics or plasma. Their weapons were based on the manipulation of spatial constants. To fire a weapon, the station had to momentarily fold space around the target, a process that required a level of precision the Kestrel's computers were struggling to provide. Every time Vane attempted to lock onto a scavenger vessel, the system would reset, sensing the mismatch in processing power. He realized he couldn't use the Kestrel as a bridge. He had to use himself. The archive's interface was designed for direct neural linkage, a process that carried immense risks for a human mind not adapted to such high-bandwidth communication. Without hesitating, Vane removed his helmet's interface cable and plugged it directly into the obsidian pedestal. His world exploded into a cascade of pure information. He was no longer a man standing in a room. He was the station. He felt the flow of coolant in the pipes, the hum of the reactor in the basement, and the irritating itch of the scavengers on the outer hull. Mara watched in terror as Vane's body stiffened, his eyes rolling back as his nervous system was flooded with the station's sensory data. She wanted to pull him away, but she knew that breaking the connection now would likely liquefy his brain. Instead, she focused on providing the necessary support, using her own console to balance the power surges that were threatening to burn out his suit's internal regulators. Through Vane's link, the station finally woke up. On the observation deck, Aris saw the first of the station's defenses engage. A series of hidden apertures along the rings opened, and instead of beams of light, the space around the lead scavenger cruiser simply ceased to be. The ship didn't explode. It was simply erased, compressed into a microscopic point of infinite density, and then released as a harmless burst of hawking radiation. The scavenger fleet reacted instantly, breaking their formation and scattering to avoid the spatial collapses. They began to return fire, launching jagged shards of dark matter that impacted the station's shields with the force of mountain ranges. The battle for the archive was a silent, ethereal affair. The scavengers were trying to overwhelm the station's processing power by attacking from 1,000 different angles at once, forcing Vane to jump his consciousness across the defense grid at lightning speed. Aris rushed back to the archive, arriving just as the first scavenger boarding party managed to phase through a weakened section of the veil. They were terrifying creatures, encased in suits of jagged, matte black metal that seemed to swallow the light. They moved with a twitchy, insectoid grace, wielding weapons that fired localized gravity distortions. Aris drew his pulse carbine and took cover behind a pedestal of data crystals, the irony of using a primitive projectile weapon to defend the pinnacle of galactic achievement not lost on him. The first scavenger he hit didn't blade. It simply unraveled, its suit losing integrity and collapsing into a pile of dark, oily smoke. More were coming, stepping through the shimmering tiers in reality like ghosts entering a dream. Mara joined Aris on the firing line, using her scanner to highlight the phasing signatures of the incoming boarders before they could fully materialize. They fought with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity, moving from plaza to plaza as the scavengers pushed deeper into the archive. The beautiful projections of the precursor homeworld were shattered by the impacts of dark matter, the golden mountains flickering and dying as the projectors were destroyed. Vane, still linked to the station, felt every hit as a physical blow to his own body. He could feel the archive being defiled, the knowledge of 1 billion years being threatened by the mindless hunger of the scavengers. With a final, agonizing effort, he pushed his mind past the safety limits, reaching into the very core of the station's spatial drive. He didn't just want to fire a weapon, he wanted to move the entire station. The Kestrel's crew felt a sudden, sickening lurch as the station performed a micro-jump within the pocket dimension. They moved only a few hundred kilometers, but the transition was enough to sever the scavengers, phase links, and leave the boarding parties stranded and disconnected from their fleet. The spatial jump also created a massive gravitational wake that scattered the scavenger cruisers like dry leaves in a storm. Seizing the moment, Vane triggered the station's primary deterrent, a harmonic pulse that resonated with the scavengers' own dark matter engines. Across the indigo sky, the enemy ships began to glow with an internal, sickly violet light before imploding one by one. The threat was not gone, but the immediate siege had been broken. Vane collapsed as the link severed, his breathing shallow and his skin pale, but he was alive. Aris and Mara stood among the ruins of the archive, the silence returning to the glass halls, heavier and more somber than before. They had defended the legacy, but they had also learned the true cost of their discovery. The universe was not just a place of wonder, it was a place of ancient, undying hunger. The victory over the scavengers had come at a steep psychological and structural cost, leaving the archive of echoes in a state of flickering disarray. While the immediate threat of the matte black fleet had been neutralized, the station was now hemorrhaging energy as it struggled to maintain the spatial anchors that kept it seated within the pocket dimension. Aris helped Vane into a portable medical cradle within the Kestrel's small infirmary, the engineer's nervous system still twitching with the residual static of the station's massive data flow. Mara, meanwhile, was focused on the external sensors, watching as the indigo sky outside the hull began to bleed into a sickly, translucent gray. The micro-jump had saved them, but it had also cracked the local continuum, and the veil was no longer a solid barrier but a tattered shroud. They could see the stars of the known universe through the gaps, but they looked distorted, like pebbles seen through the surface of a rushing stream. Aris knew they couldn't stay in the upper spires. They needed to descend into the substructure, the literal foundation of the station where the spatial stabilizers were housed. If they couldn't repair the anchors, the station would drift out of the pocket dimension and be torn apart by the shearing forces of the transition. The descent into the substructure required them to bypass the standard transit shafts, which had been locked down by the station's security protocols following the breach. Instead, they were forced to use the maintenance conduits, narrow, lightless tunnels that wound through the very thickness of the station's outer shell. These passages were never intended for organic occupants. They were the domain of the station's autonomous repair systems, a labyrinth of pipes, cables, and high-voltage busbars that hummed with a dangerous, erratic energy. The walls here were not the elegant glass of the archive, but a raw, grey alloy that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. Aris led the way, his suit's floodlights cutting through a thick, oily fog that seemed to be a byproduct of the failing stabilizers. Every few minutes, the entire station would shudder, a deep-seated vibration that made the metal around them groan like a dying beast. Mara followed closely, her scanner now tuned to detect spatial anomalies rather than biological signs. She warned Aris that the very air in these tunnels was becoming unstable. Localized pockets of distorted gravity were forming and dissolving at random, capable of crushing a human body or stretching it into a thin ribbon of matter in a heartbeat. They reached a junction where four massive conduits met, forming a vaulted chamber filled with a forest of pulsating crystalline rods. This was the filter, the system that translated the raw energy of the resonant core into the refined spatial harmonics required by the anchors. One of the rods had shattered during the scavenger attack, its shards floating in a localized zero-gravity field and glowing with a fierce, unstable white light. The breach had introduced a feedback loop into the system, causing the other rods to vibrate at a frequency that was slowly shaking the substructure to pieces. To fix it, they had to manually bypass the broken rod and recalibrate the remaining array. This required someone to enter the zero-gravity field and physically manipulate the crystalline fragments, a task that was essentially a suicide mission due to the high levels of exotic radiation being emitted by the shattered core. Aris looked at Mara, then at the glowing shards. He began to unbuckle his primary gear, intending to go in himself, but Mara stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. She pointed to her scanner, which showed that her suit had a higher degree of radiation shielding specifically designed for handling biohazardous and high-energy materials. The tension in the filter was palpable as Mara drifted into the shimmering field of the broken rod. The light was so bright that it washed out the HUD in her helmet, forcing her to rely on the tactile feedback of her suit's gloves. Aris watched from the safety of the junction, his heart hammering against his ribs as he monitored her vital signs. Her heart rate was spiking, and the radiation counters on her suit were climbing toward the red zone at an alarming rate. She moved with agonizing slowness, her fingers plucking the razor-sharp shards of crystal from the air and placing them into a containment canister. Each movement was a calculated risk. If she touched two shards together at the wrong angle, the resulting energy discharge would vaporize her instantly. After what felt like hours, the last of the fragments was secured, and the white glare began to fade. The remaining rods in the filter immediately shifted their frequency, the violent vibrations subsiding into a steady, rhythmic thrum. Mara pushed herself back toward the junction, her movements sluggish and her breathing heavy. Aris caught her and pulled her into the corridor, sealing the hatch behind them just as the filter's automatic cooling systems engaged, flooding the chamber with liquid nitrogen. Despite the repair, the station was still drifting. They continued their descent, reaching the anchor chamber at the very base of the spire. This was a place of titanic scale, dominated by three massive pillars of obsidian that extended downward into a bottomless abyss. These pillars were the anchors, projecting a gravitational tether that hooked into the fabric of the pocket dimension itself. One of the pillars was out of alignment, its surface covered in a layer of crystalline frost as it struggled to maintain its grip on reality. The control interface for the anchors was a massive circular platform that floated in the center of the abyss, connected to the walkway by a single, narrow bridge of translucent glass. As they stepped onto the platform, the silver holographic echo reappeared, its form now ragged and translucent, like a dying flame. It spoke of the finality of their situation. The anchors were failing because the pocket dimension itself was dissolving. The precursors had built this place as a temporary refuge, but they had never intended for it to last forever. The return of the scavengers and the stress of the battle had accelerated the natural decay of the dimension's walls. The Echo explained that the only way to save the Kestrel and its crew was to initiate a forced ejection. They had to decouple the station from the anchors and use the remaining energy in the resonant core to blast a hole back into normal space. However, this process would permanently destroy the station and all the knowledge it contained. Aris looked around the anchor chamber, at the obsidian pillars and the ancient, beautiful machinery that represented the pinnacle of a lost civilization. To destroy this place felt like a betrayal of everything they had come to find. But the alternative was to remain here and be crushed as the dimension collapsed into a singularity. He looked at Vane, who had managed to rejoin them, his face pale but his eyes clear. Vane nodded slowly, understanding the necessity of the choice. They were the keepers of the flame now. The knowledge they had already gathered would have to be enough. They couldn't save the library, but they could save the librarians. The process of decoupling the anchors was a violent affair. Aris and Vane worked the control platform, slaving the station's remaining power to the ejection sequence, while Mara monitored the spatial integrity of the surrounding space. The obsidian pillars began to glow with an intense violet light, and the sound of the station's engines rose to a deafening roar. The floor beneath them buckled as the gravitational tethers were severed, one by one. The first pillar shattered with a sound like a thunderclap, sending massive fragments of obsidian tumbling into the abyss. The second followed shortly after, the resulting shockwave throwing the team to the floor. As the third and final anchor began to crack, the violet sky outside the station turned a blinding, brilliant white. The veil was gone, replaced by a roaring tunnel of pure energy that reached out to pull them back into the known galaxy. They scrambled back toward the Kestrel, the station literally falling apart around them. Sections of the floor were vanishing into nothingness, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and ancient dust. They reached the airlock of the ship just as the anchor chamber began to implode. Aris slammed the manual override, and the Kestrel's engines roared to life, pulling them away from the dying station. From the bridge, they watched as the great glass structure was drawn into the white light of the ejection tunnel. It didn't burn, it simply folded in on itself, becoming smaller and smaller until it was a single, shimmering point of light that finally winked out of existence. The Kestrel was catapulted forward, the stars of the known universe blurring into long, white streaks as they rode the shockwave of the station's destruction. When the movement finally stopped, they were back in the familiar blackness of the void, the shimmering veil nowhere to be seen. They were home, or at least back in the space they knew. Aris looked at the empty sensors, then at his crew. They were battered, exhausted, and carrying a weight of knowledge that would change the course of human history forever. The glass horizon was gone, but the path it had revealed was still there, waiting for them to take the first step. The return to conventional space was not a smooth transition, but a violent re-entry into the laws of physics that had felt distant and malleable within the glass station. The Kestrel tumbled through a wake of dissipating spatial energy, its hull groaning as the structural integrity sensors screamed in a cacophony of red light warnings. Aris gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles white against the dark polymer, while Vane worked feverishly to stabilize the thrusters. The brilliant white light of the ejection tunnel had faded, replaced by the familiar, cold comfort of distant stars, yet something was fundamentally different. The sensors were struggling to lock onto known pulsars, and the star charts on the primary display were flickering with a series of errors. They were back in the known galaxy, but the precise coordinates remained elusive, obscured by the massive electromagnetic interference still clinging to the ship like a shroud. Mara sat in the science station, her eyes fixed on the data cores they had managed to salvage from the archive of echoes. They were warm to the touch, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that seemed to synchronize with the beating of her own heart. The silence that followed the engine stabilization was heavy, a vacuum of sound that emphasized the magnitude of their loss. The station, with its billions of years of history and its crystalline beauty, was gone, reduced to a memory and a few kilograms of exotic data crystals. Vane was the first to speak, his voice rasping from the strain of the neural link he had endured. He noted that the ship's internal chronometers were out of sync with the galactic standard beacon, suggesting that their time within the pocket dimension had been subject to a severe temporal dilation. They had been gone for months, perhaps even years, according to the external clocks. This revelation added a new layer of urgency to their situation. If they had been missing for that long, the political landscape of the frontier might have shifted, and their discovery could be a catalyst for a conflict they were no longer prepared to handle. Aris ordered a full diagnostic of the communications array, wanting to know if any of their distress signals had reached the nearest relay stations before they were drawn into the veil. As the ship systems slowly recovered, Mara began to notice a series of strange readings on the long-range scanners. They were not alone in this sector. A series of thermal ghosts were trailing them, staying just at the edge of the Kestrel's sensor range. These were not the scavengers. The signatures were too clean, too clinical. They were human. Aris felt a surge of relief that was quickly replaced by a sharp, instinctive caution. In the outer rim, a lone scout ship returning from uncharted space with a cargo of precursor technology was more of a target than a guest. He ordered the ship into a silent running mode, cutting the main power to the engines and relying on the cold gas thrusters for minor adjustments. They drifted behind a massive, pockmarked asteroid, using its bulk to mask their heat signature from the approaching vessels. From their hiding spot, they watched as three sleek, black-hulled frigates swept through the area where the Kestrel had materialized. The ships bore no markings, no faction logos, and no transponder signals. They were hunters, and they were looking for exactly what the Kestrel was carrying. The realization that they were being hunted by their own kind was a bitter pill to swallow. Aris knew that the data they carried, the secrets of spatial folding, and the blueprints for the glass station's reactor was worth more than the combined wealth of the core worlds. It was a power that could end scarcity or fuel 1,000 years of war, and it was currently sitting in a small, battered scout ship with a crew of 3. Vane suggested that they attempt to decode a portion of the data crystals to find a way to enhance the Kestrel's cloaking systems, but Mara argued against it. The information was too dense, too alien. Attempting to integrate it into the ship's primitive systems without a dedicated laboratory could result in another catastrophic energy discharge. They were trapped between a hostile fleet and a cargo they couldn't fully control. Aris decided on a third option. They would head for the Uit cloud of a nearby red dwarf, a region of dense ice and dust where they could lose their pursuers and begin the long process of repairing the Kestrel's long-range jump drive. The journey to the red dwarf was a grueling exercise in tension. Every flicker on the sensor screen was a potential threat, and every groan of the hull was a reminder of the damage they had sustained. Vane spent his hours in the crawl spaces of the ship, bypasses, and jury-rigging the primary conduits to squeeze every bit of efficiency out of the failing reactor. Mara remained in the science bay, not to decode the data, but to listen to it. She had found that the crystals emitted a rhythmic pulsing that could be translated into a visual medium. She spent her nights watching the walls of the bay fill with the swirling, golden fractals of the precursor language, trying to find a pattern, a message, or even just a name for the people they had lost. She found that the beings did not call themselves precursors. That was a human label. Their name, when translated through the lens of their mathematical poetry, was something closer to the keepers of the long light. They were a race that viewed time not as a sequence of events, but as a vast, interconnected landscape, and they had seen the end of their era long before it arrived. As they reached the outer edges of the Uat cloud, the black frigates reappeared. They had anticipated the Kestrel's trajectory, utilizing a sophisticated predictive algorithm that suggested a level of technological backing far beyond a simple pirate band. A volley of precision-guided missiles streaked through the dark, their paths calculated to disable the Kestrel's engines without destroying the hull. Aris took the helm, his movements a blur as he threw the scout ship into a series of gut-wrenching maneuvers. They dived into the heart of a massive ice shelf, using the Kestrel's mining lasers to carve a path through the frozen debris. The missiles impacted the ice behind them, the resulting explosions sending shards of frozen nitrogen and methane venting into the void like a second sun. The frigates followed them in, their superior speed hampered by the treacherous environment. It was a cat-and-mouse game played out in a labyrinth of ancient ice, where a single mistake would mean certain death for everyone involved. In the heat of the pursuit, the Kestrel's main reactor began to fail, its containment fields bucking under the strain of the high-G maneuvers. Vane reported that they had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the core went critical. Aris looked at Mara, a silent question in his eyes. She understood. She reached for the primary data crystal, the one that had been recovered from the heart of the resonant core, and plugged it into the Kestrel's secondary power bus. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. The ship systems screamed as they were flooded with an influx of exotic matter that they were never meant to handle. The bridge lights flared into a brilliant emerald green, and the Kestrel's engines didn't just fire. They roared with a sound that vibrated through the very atoms of the ship. The scout ship accelerated with a velocity that defied inertia, punching through the ice shelf and emerging into the open void like a bolt of green lightning. The black frigates were left behind, their sensors unable to track a craft that was moving in a way that violated the local laws of motion. They were safe for the moment, but the cost was high. The Kestrel's internal systems were smoking, the insulation on the cables charred by the intensity of the power surge. The emerald glow of the data crystal was fading, its energy spent in that one desperate burst of speed. They were drifting in the deep dark between stars, their position unknown and their ship a hollow shell. But as Aris looked out the viewing port, he saw that the Kestrel was no longer just a ship. The hull had begun to change, the silver plates taking on the translucent, glass-like quality of the station they had left behind. The ship was evolving, the precursor technology beginning to merge with the human craft in a symbiotic union. They were no longer just explorers, they were becoming something new, a bridge between the past and the future. Aris leaned back in his chair, feeling the steady thrum of the new heart beating within the ship. They had escaped the hunters, but the real journey was just beginning. They had the map, they had the ship, and now they had the time. The transformation of the Kestrel was not merely aesthetic, it was fundamental. As the ship drifted in the silent expanse between the red dwarf and the nearest charted relay, the translucent sheen on the hull thickened, becoming a resilient biopolymer that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic emerald light. Inside the cabin, the sharp tang of ozone had been replaced by a scent reminiscent of rain on sun-warmed stone. The consoles had softened, their rigid metal edges flowing into ergonomic curves that responded to the proximity of the crew's hands before they even made physical contact. Aris sat at the center of this metamorphosis, feeling a strange, calm clarity. The ship's computer, once a series of literal binary processors, now felt like a presence at the back of his mind, a vast, sleeping intellect that was slowly waking up to the reality of its new human inhabitants. Vane and Mara moved through the ship with a similar sense of wonder, their fatigue forgotten as they witnessed the seamless integration of human grit and precursor elegance. The damage from the pursuit had not just been repaired, the ship had been rebuilt into something capable of traversing the long light. Mara spent the final hours of their journey cataloging the final sequence of the primary data crystal. She discovered that the keepers of the long light had not fled their dimension out of fear, but out of a sense of duty to the wider universe. They had seen a coming age of darkness, a period where the expansion of the cosmos would lead to the isolation of all sentient life, and they had built the glass stations as anchors to prevent the great disconnect. The Kestrel was now a mobile anchor, a seed of that ancient network. As she worked, the data began to display not just technical schematics, but a map of other hidden repositories scattered across the galaxy, places of healing, of infinite energy, and of recorded histories that reached back to the very first stars. The mission had changed once again. They were no longer just survivors or scouts. They were the first crew of a new fleet, tasked with waking the galaxy from its long, fragmented slumber. The weight of this destiny was immense, yet it felt right, a culmination of every struggle they had endured since crossing the Veil. The black frigates did not reappear. Whether they had been destroyed by the Kestrel's sudden acceleration or simply lost its trail in the distorted wake of the exotic matter was unknown. Regardless, the threat felt distant now, a relic of a smaller way of thinking. Aris commanded the ship to bring the primary jump drive online, but the ship did not respond with the usual mechanical whine. Instead, the walls hummed in a deep, melodic chord that vibrated through the floorboards. The stars in the viewing port did not stretch into streaks. They simply shifted, the perspective of the ship moving not through space, but through the underlying fabric of reality. In a heartbeat, the red dwarf was gone, replaced by the familiar sight of the outpost Delta Station, the gateway to the human frontier. The massive orbital structure looked clunky and primitive compared to the elegant lines of the modified Kestrel, a collection of bolted-together cylinders and spinning rings that seemed to belong to a different age. As they approached the station, the Kestrel's new communications array bypassed the standard radio frequencies, broadcasting a signal that was felt by every person on the outpost as a sense of profound peace and curiosity. Aris didn't send a standard docking request. He sent a message of greeting from the keepers of the long light, a declaration that the era of isolation was over. The station's defense platforms remained silent, their targeting sensors unable to lock onto a ship that existed in a state of partial phase shift. They drifted toward the primary docking arm, the emerald light of the Kestrel's hull casting long, dancing shadows across the outpost's weathered metal plates. On the bridge, Vane reached out and touched the glass-like surface of the main console, feeling the warmth of the ship's heart. He looked at Aris and Mara, seeing in their eyes the same resolution he felt in his own. They were home, but they were also the beginning of something that would eventually make the concept of home span the entire galaxy. The airlock cycled with a soft chime, and for the first time in months, The crew prepared to step out into a human environment. They did not wear their bulky EVA suits. The ship had created a localized atmospheric envelope that would protect them until they were safely within the outpost's pressurized halls. As the outer door slid open, Aris looked back at the bridge one last time. The holographic echo of the silver figure appeared briefly near the command chair, giving a slow, solemn nod before fading into the emerald glow of the walls. The repository was gone, but its spirit was alive in the silver and glass of the Kestrel. They had brought the light back from the void, and now it was time to share it with a world that had forgotten how to look at the stars with anything other than fear. Aris stepped onto the docking arm, his boots echoing on the metal with a sound that felt like the first note of a new symphony. The journey of the Kestrel had ended, but the mission of humanity had just begun. The secrets of the glass horizon were no longer locked away in a dying dimension. They were here, in the hands of three people who had seen the end of the world and decided to build a better one. As the doors of the outpost opened to receive them, the violet light of the far-off pocket dimension seemed to linger in their eyes, a permanent reminder of the beauty and the responsibility they now carried. The long light was burning, and for the first time in history, the darkness of the void had a reason to be afraid. They walked forward into the crowded corridors of the station, the first heralds of a future where the stars were no longer distant pinpoints, but destinations waiting to be reached.